The train moved steadily through the heart of the ancient forests, its rhythm a constant, mechanical thrum against the backdrop of towering trees and dense undergrowth. The wheels clicked against the iron tracks, echoing through the thick greenery that seemed to swallow the train whole. Inside one of the passenger cars, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of coal smoke and old leather. Professor André sat near the window, his gaze occasionally drifting to the blurred landscape outside before returning to his companions. He let out a soft sigh, breaking the silence of the compartment. He admitted, with a tone of mild disbelief, that he never thought he would be going on a mission with the students. It was an unexpected turn of events for a man of his academic standing. The only reason he was even present, accompanying them on this journey, was due to the strict institutional rule that dictated students couldn't be sent alone on missions of this nature. Regulations were regulations, even for someone as experienced as him. Across from the professor, sitting in the opposite row, were Zeke, Asta, and Diego. They formed a tight-knit group, their youthful energy contrasting with the professor's more weathered demeanor. Professor André leaned forward slightly, his expression shifting into one of academic focus. He noted that there was something he must explain before they reached their destination. He looked at each of them in turn and asked the students if they knew anything about the place they were going, Del Poa. Zeke was the first to respond. His voice was steady, reflecting the discipline he maintained. He replied that he had briefly learned about the region during class, recalling fragments of lectures and maps. He added, his face growing visibly serious, that he heard that unlike other places, mages were the most powerful figures there. Power in Del Poa wasn't measured just by physical might, but by the depth of one's mana. Professor André nodded in agreement, his eyes reflecting a certain respect for the unique complexity of the region. He confirmed it was indeed a place with a unique system, one that stood in stark contrast to the traditional martial hierarchies they were accustomed to. Unlike other places where knights might lead a charge with swords drawn, the knights of Del Poa operated mainly with shields. He began to describe their tactical doctrine in detail. In battle, when the knights push the enemies with their heavy shields held firmly in front, they form an impenetrable wall of steel. While the knights hold the line and absorb the brunt of the physical pressure, the mages fight by pouring devastating magical attacks from the rear. It was a strategy of suppression and annihilation, where the shield-bearers served as the anvil and the mages as the hammer. Asta, listening intently, tilted his head and asked a logical question. He wondered that in such a case, wouldn't the damage to allies close to the enemy be great? If mages were raining down spells from behind the front line, the risk of friendly fire seemed dangerously high. The professor acknowledged the concern, noting that it was a good question. He explained that to prevent such a catastrophe, the Del Poa knights train more often to run with their shields and coordinate their movements with surgical precision. They had to be faster and more disciplined than typical heavy infantry to ensure they weren't caught in the crossfire of their own mages. This specialized, almost subservient role was the reason why the Del Poa knights weren't popular with Valhalla graduates. Most who trained at Valhalla sought glory and individual prowess, not to be a living wall for a mage's convenience. Hearing that, Diego chimed in, his brow furrowed in thought. He asked if it was essentially a knight's order just for wizards, a support force rather than a primary combat unit. He followed up with a more pressing concern, if that was truly the case, then in the upcoming fight against the Black Knight, they wouldn't be able to cooperate with the Del Poa knights without that specific kind of training. Their own fighting styles were far more aggressive and independent. Professor André looked at Diego, impressed by the realization. He said he understood the concept well and told him not to be very surprised when they finally arrived at Del Poa. However, as the conversation turned toward the local leadership, the professor's demeanor shifted. He snapped, the memory of past interactions with the mages of Del Poa clearly irritating him. He cursed at them under his breath, his voice laced with genuine resentment. He said they were awfully arrogant, a trait that seemed to be a cultural staple of the city's magical elite. Eventually, the forest thinned, and they finally reached the city of Del Poa. It was a great city, a sprawling metropolis that radiated riches and historical weight. Tall, artistic buildings with intricate facades and soaring spires were shining brightly under the midday sun. The architecture was a testament to the city's wealth, with marble and gold leaf catching the light at every corner. As they reached the city gate, a knight came forward to receive them. He moved with a practiced grace, the sound of his armor a rhythmic clank against the paved ground. As they shook hands, the professor greeted him formally, introducing himself as André Draker, assistant professor at Valhalla. The knight's eyes widened slightly behind his visor. He was clearly surprised to see someone from the prestigious Draker family in person. He bowed his head respectfully and said it was his honor that such a man had come to their city. The knight then introduced himself as Jorge Outer, commander of the 8th Delpoa Knights. He was clad in a full-body armor that was polished to a mirror finish, shining brilliantly under the harsh sun. Despite the weight of his gear, his face was full of a genuine, warm smile, welcoming them to the city. The professor then introduced the 3 students standing behind him. He gestured toward them, telling Jorge that these were the cadets who had come along with him. He didn't hold back his praise, describing them as the best talents currently at Valhalla. It was a high compliment, one that Zeke and the others accepted with stoic nods. Professor Andre then turned to the students, assuring them that there would be no problem with the mission and telling them not to worry. Jorge, clearly moved by the professor's confidence, said that Andre's words made him trust the group even more. He then gestured toward a lavish carriage parked nearby, mentioning that the commander was waiting inside. Diego, always the most observant of social hierarchies, whispered to Zeke with a confused expression. He asked Zeke, didn't the hairy guy, referring to Jorge, just say he was the commander earlier? He was trying to confirm his suspicion about who was really in charge. Zeke, sensing the need for discretion, told him to just stay still and keep his mouth shut. At that moment, the carriage door opened. A blonde mage was sitting inside, draped in expensive, flowing robes. His face was filled with a palpable sense of arrogance, his features sharp and cold. He looked down at the group from Valhalla with a face full of undisguised disgust, as if their very presence was an inconvenience to his day. Diego looked back at him with an equally sharp gaze, noting the man's demeanor. He muttered that the guy looked seriously bad-tempered, his irritation rising. Zeke again told him to stay quiet, his own eyes narrowed. Zeke thought to himself that this must be Delphoa's mage commander. It was a surprising sight to see that even Jorge Outer, a knight commander, looked flustered and subservient before the mage. The power dynamic in this city was even more skewed than the professor had described. Jorge and the mage commander talked for a brief, tense moment. The mage didn't even bother to step out of his carriage. After the exchange, Jorge walked back to the people from Valhalla, who were standing a short distance away. With a somewhat apologetic look, he told them that the mage commander said he would go separately. He then informed them that they would need to take a different, much less grand carriage to their quarters. Professor Andre and the cadets were genuinely surprised at such blatant arrogance. The mage commander's carriage then left without saying a single word of greeting or acknowledgement to the visitors. Diego finally snapped. He screamed, his voice echoing near the gate, saying that the man had just ignored them like a dog and left. The others stood in silence, quietly swallowing the humiliation that had been forced upon them. Diego continued shouting, his face red with anger, insisting that no matter who that man was, what he did was not right. They had traveled a great distance for a joint mission, only to be humiliated like dogs at the very entrance of the city. But before he could finish his tirade, Zeke moved. He kicked Diego's foot, hard. The sudden impact sent Diego tumbling to the ground in pain. He cursed at Zeke, clutching his foot, and then looked up at Professor Andre, demanding to know why the professor wasn't saying anything to defend them. Professor Andre didn't look angry, instead, he smiled slightly, a weary and knowing expression. He told the cadets that after graduation, they would face situations like this often in their lives as knights. Politics and ego were as much a part of the job as swords and shields. He instructed them to remember well what they were experiencing from then on, using it as a lesson for the future. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the golden splendor of Delpoa faded into long, cold shadows. The night fell, and the cadets were shown to their quarters. Instead of the artistic buildings they had seen earlier, they were given a dark, run-down dormitory to sleep in. The walls were cracked, the air was musty, and the furniture was falling apart. Diego and Asta, exhausted from the long day of travel and the emotional roller coaster of their arrival, were soon sleeping like death. Their heavy breathing filled the small room, but Zeke remained wide awake. He lay on his thin mattress, staring up at the ceiling where the plaster was peeling away. He thought to himself that the two sides of this city were really different. The lodging they were staying in looked completely worn out, as if it had been rushed or neglected for decades. Yet, every mage facility they had passed on the way here clearly had vast amounts of money poured into them. It was a blatant display of where the city's priorities lay. It was not like Zeke was expecting much luxury in the first place, but the disparity was jarring. Restless, Zeke eventually got up from his bed. He couldn't sleep, his mind racing with thoughts of the mission and the strange atmosphere of the city. He whispered to the empty room that he would step out for some air. He began walking through the large, dimly lit corridor of the dormitory. As he moved, he thought about the treatment they had received. He really didn't care about being treated like that. He had gone through far worse humiliations and hardships in his previous life. A cold carriage and a dusty room were nothing compared to the scars of his past. What truly worried him wasn't his pride, but the Black Yiksha subjugation mission itself. His face grew visibly worried as he analyzed the situation. He remembered the strategy meeting they had attended briefly upon arrival. Commander Jorge and the other knights had just stood there silently, like statues, listening to the mages talk and dictate terms. Zeke had already expected the mages to be in charge, but the sheer extent of the knights' subservience was beyond what he had imagined. It was a recipe for disaster in a real combat scenario. Lost in these dark thoughts, Zeke didn't notice where he was going until he nearly stumbled. He found himself standing before the mage commander from earlier. He had been so drawn into his own reflections that he had wandered near the more affluent sections of the compound. The mage commander looked at him, his blonde hair silvered by the moonlight. He asked what Zeke was doing there alone. Zeke looked up, startled by the sudden voice, and saw the man standing before him with the same look of disgust as before. Without giving Zeke any time to formulate an answer, the mage commander said he had something to say, so this was good timing. He stated coldly that there was nothing for Valhalla to do there. He told Zeke not to get dragged into magic nonsense and, in a sharp, ordering tone, told him to just go back to where he came from quietly. Zeke's face filled with sudden anger. He clenched his fist tightly, the leather of his glove creaking. He thought to himself, if you feel that way, then why did you even ask for our cooperation? He felt a sudden, violent urge to punch the man's arrogant face. The mage commander's eyes then dropped to Zeke's hand, specifically his glove. He froze for a second, his expression shifting from disgust to something more intense. He instantly recognized the item and asked Zeke if he was a pure-blooded Draker Awakener. Zeke looked him straight in the eyes, his gaze hard. He said it was correct and asked if there was a problem with that. The mage commander's face flushed with a sudden, localized anger. He hissed, asking how Zeke dared to act so insolently toward him. He then threatened Zeke, warning him that he had better not take off that glove while he was in this city, especially if he wanted to finish the mission and return home safely. Having delivered his threat, he turned around and vanished into the darkness of the corridor. Zeke stood there in the heavy silence, watching the fading figure of the man. He thought the mage was awfully sensitive. He knew that pure-blooded awakeners like himself possessed a natural mana-disrupting power, which was likely why the mage felt so threatened. Suddenly, another figure approached from the shadows behind him. A voice called out his name. Zeke turned around quickly, his hand moving toward his side. The person asked again if it was really Zeke. As the figure stepped into the moonlight, Zeke saw that it was Professor Feynman. Professor Feynman walked toward him, his face full of a warm, familiar smile. He said it had been a long time since they last saw each other and asked how Zeke was doing. Zeke, slightly more relaxed now, replied that he was fine and asked the professor how he had been. Professor Feynman explained that there was no better place to build a career as a mage than Delpoa. He added that he had recently felt that research alone was not enough to truly understand the depths of magic, so he had volunteered for this specific mission. He then asked what had brought Zeke all the way to this city. Zeke told him simply that he came because of the Black Yiksha mission. As soon as those words left Zeke's mouth, Professor Feynman's face turned deathly pale. The smile vanished instantly. He grabbed Zeke's arm and led him to a quiet, secluded corner of the hallway. He whispered that he had something vital to tell him. Once they were in a quiet corner where no one could overhear, Zeke asked what he meant by saying he had something to say. Professor Feynman looked Zeke in the eyes, his voice trembling slightly. He told Zeke not to go out in the next day's mission. Zeke was taken aback, his surprise evident. He asked what the professor could possibly mean by that. With a deadly serious face, Professor Feynman leaned in closer. He told Zeke that the mission was already destined to fail. He repeated it with an air of absolute certainty, telling Zeke to never, under any circumstances, go on that mission. Zeke stood there, shocked by the news. The weight of the warning hung in the cold night air, turning his growing worries into a chilling reality.